It had been 6 months since I started slinging hash at the Starlight Diner, and honestly, 6 months too long. 6 months of grease, graveyard shifts, and rules that made less sense than day-old coffee. 6 months of seeing things in the periphery, things that moved when they shouldn't, shadows that lingered a beat too long. 6 months of wondering if the sunrise would actually come, or if the fluorescent hum of the starlight was the only light left in the world. I hadn't wanted this job. I needed it. My car was a symphony of rattles and cobs, my bank account a flatlining EKG, and my landlord was starting to look at me with the same hungry glint in his eye as the stray cats outside my apartment. Then, like a beacon in the financial fog, the help-wanted graveyard shift sign blinked in the Starlight Diner window. 15 an hour, plus tips. The sign declared in cheerful red lettering, benefits after 60 days. It was practically shouting divine intervention. I practically slid across the sticky vinyl of booth 7 to get to the counter. The hiring process was efficient. A 5-minute chat with a guy who introduced himself as Frank, the manager, who barely glanced at my crumpled resume before saying, "You breathe. You're hired. Start tonight, midnight." He pushed a folded, grease-stained paper across the counter. "Read this. Memorize it. Live by it." I didn't unfold the paper until I got home that afternoon as night. I figured it would be standard diner stuff, uniform guidelines, how to handle a hangry customer, maybe the secret to their suspiciously popular chili. I was wrong. The paper was a single, flimsy sheet, typed in a stark sans serif font. No Starlight Diner logo, no employee handbook fluff, just a list numbered 1 through 13. Starlight Diner graveyard shift rules. Follow exactly. 1. Clock in between 11:50 p.m. and 11:59 or at midnight sharp. 2. Bring your own coffee thermos. Diner coffee till 2 a.m. is different. 3. Always work in pairs after 1 a.m., except in the walk-in freezer. Never enter the walk-in freezer with another person. 4. If the jukebox starts playing Teenager in Love by Diane and the Bellmans between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., immediately proceed to the kitchen until it stops. Do not sing along. 5. Avoid prolonged eye contact with anyone wearing a red apron. 6. If a customer enters after 2 a.m., discreetly notify Frank. Do not serve them yourself unless they are regular. 7. Some booths may appear deeper than they should be. Serve only the edge of the table you can reach without leaning too far. 8. Booth A7 is off limits for cleaning between 4:17 a.m. and 4:31 a.m. 9. If you hear someone calling name from the kitchen, ignore it unless you can clearly see Frank's face. 10. Should you encounter sugar packets arranged in a pyramid, do not disturb them. Notify Frank immediately. 11. The mirrors behind the counter some show reflections that don't match the diner. Ignore these and keep working. 12. If the neon, Hope in 24 hours sign outside flickers in quick succession, proceed to the back office and remain there until it stabilizes. 13. Never, under any circumstances, acknowledge the waitress in white. She is not on the schedule. I snorted, folding the paper back up. This had to be a joke, right? Some elaborate hazing ritual for new graveyard shift suckers. But rent was due, and the Starlight was hiring, so I decided to play along. My first night was surprisingly normal. I clocked in at 11:56 p.m., rule number 1 already half forgotten until I saw the time clock. Frank introduced me to Maria, who was going to show me the ropes. "You read the rules?" Maria asked, handing me a stack of minutes thicker than a Stephen King novel. "Yeah," I chuckled. "Pretty thorough." Maria's expression didn't change. "Follow them. All of them. It's just a joke, right, to mess with the newbie." Maria stopped wiping down the counter and looked at me with a seriousness that made the hairs on my arms prickle. "Listen," she said, her voice low. "I don't care if you believe me now. You will. By the end of the week, those rules, they keep you safe." She tapped the paper I'd tucked into my apron. "Break one, even by accident." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Just don't." I wanted to press her, ask what she meant, but Frank bellowed from the kitchen. "Maria, coffee's dying out here." The rest of my first shift was uneventful. I refilled salt and pepper shakers, brewed industrial quantities of coffee, and tried to ignore the unsettlingly cheerful clown painting hanging above booth 3. It wasn't until my third night that I saw something that made me start taking those ridiculous rules seriously. It was around 2:30 a.m. The diner was dead, just me and Maria, the low hum of the refrigerators, and the rhythmic clatter of Maria's spatula scraping the grill. I was restocking napkin holders at the front counter when I heard the bell above the door jingle. Looking up, I saw a man standing just inside the entrance. He was tall, gaunt, dressed in a threadbare suit that seemed too big for him. Rule number 6 flashed in my mind, If a customer enters after 2 a.m., discreetly notify Frank. Do not serve them yourself unless they are a regular. I reached for the phone behind the counter, my heart starting to thump a little faster. Before I could dial, Maria was already beside me, her voice calm but tight. "Sir, I'm afraid we're closed." And the man turned towards us, and the blood in my veins seemed to turn to ice water. His eyes, they weren't right. They were too wide, too bright, reflecting the diner lights like polished obsidian. And they didn't blink. "Just hungry," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across asphalt. "Need coffee." Maria's hand clamped onto my arm as I instinctively started to move forward. "We're not serving anymore tonight," she said firmly. "Kitchen's closed. Maybe try the gas station down the road." The man's unblinking gaze fixed on me. "Smelled new," he whispered, his smile stretching impossibly wide, revealing teeth that were too long, too sharp. "Fresh." A sudden, sharp crack of static burst from the ancient radio perched on the counter. The man's head snapped up, his smile vanishing. He hissed, a sound like air escaping a punctured tire, then turned and melted back into the night. Frank appeared moments later, his face grim. "You saw him," he muttered, his eyes scanning the empty doorway. "What the hell was that?" I stammered, my heart still hammering against my ribs. "Someone who doesn't follow the rules," Frank said cryptically. "Jet back to work. Stay with Maria until your shift ends." After that night, I memorized every rule. I followed them religiously. Most shifts passed without incident, just the usual graveyard weirdness, the occasional flickering light, the strange shadows in the corners. But every now and then, something happened that reminded me why those rules existed. Like the night I almost broke rule number 8. It was 4:16 a.m. I desperately needed to use the restroom. I remembered rule number 8 just in time. Booth and 7 is off limits for cleaning between 4:17 a.m. and 4:31 a.m. I rushed to the back, practically sprinting to the employee bathroom. As I washed my hands, I glanced at my watch. 4:16 a.m. I had 1 minute. I dried my hands and reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Something was holding it shut from the other side. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep the panic from my voice. "I need to get out." No response, just silence. Then a low, wet thump against the door, like something heavy and fleshy hitting the wood. My watch read 4:17 a.m. The lights in the bathroom flickered, then dimmed to a sickly, yellow glow. The thumping grew louder, more insistent. Something scraped against the door, long, dragging sounds like claws on wood. I backed into the far corner, trying not to breathe, trying not to make a sound. The temperature in the small bathroom plummeted. I could see my breath fogging in the air. The thumping on the door became rhythmic, almost like it was sniffing, searching. For 14 excruciating minutes, I stood frozen in that corner, the thumping and scraping continuing, occasionally punctuated by a heavy bang that rattled the door in its frame, but couldn't get in. At exactly 4:31 a.m., the lights returned to normal. The temperature rose, and the door swung open on its own, revealing an empty hallway. Frank was waiting outside, leaning against the wall, looking at his watch. "You're lucky," he said quietly. "Next time, check the time before you go." I nodded, unable to speak through the chattering of my teeth. What happens if someone's in there during those times? I finally managed to ask. Frank's expression darkened. "We lost 3 dishwashers that way," he said, his voice flat. "Back when I first started managing." "We don't discuss it." Weeks passed. I learned to navigate the strange reality of graveyard shifts at the Starlight. I discovered what happened if you violated other rules, mostly through the misfortune of new hires who didn't take them seriously. A kid named Billy didn't believe in bringing his own thermos. Rule number 2. He drank the diner coffee after 2 a.m. By 5 a.m., he was babbling about shadows moving in the reflection of the coffee pot, shadows with teeth. He quit mid-shift, leaving behind a half-empty mug and a stain on the counter that smelled faintly of sulfur. Then there was Sarah, who thought Teenager in Love was a cute song and hummed along when it played at 3:30 a.m., breaking rule number 4. The melody seemed to seep into her. She became obsessed with the tune, humming it constantly, unable to finish a sentence without breaking into that off-key, childish melody. One morning she walked into the walk-in freezer alone, rule number 3 violation. We found her the next day, frozen solid, a faint, distorted hum still emanating from her blue lips. I became something of a rule enforcer myself, warning new hires, keeping an eye on my coworkers. We looked out for each other. We had to. Last week I broke a rule myself. Not intentionally. It was an accident, a moment of forgetfulness that might cost me everything. I was working late, Refilling the sugar dispensers at booth 5. The neon opened 24 hours. Sign outside flickered twice in rapid succession. Rule number 12. If the neon opened 24 hours, sign outside flickers twice in quick succession, proceed to the back office and remain there until it stabilizes. I remember the rule, but I was halfway through pouring a packet of sugar into the dispenser. My body's momentum carried the motion forward. A few grains of sugar spilled onto the table as the neon sign outside stabilized. It was just a tiny spill, barely anything. But rules are rules for a reason. For a moment, nothing happened. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking I'd gotten lucky. Then, I noticed the sugar dispensers began to vibrate. All of them, up and down the counter, rattling against each other with increasing intensity. The sound of plastic against plastic grew to a deafening crescendo, then stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I heard a soft thud behind me. I turned to see a single sugar packet lying on the floor, right in front of booth 7. I didn't remember it falling, and it wasn't one of ours. The logo was slightly wrong, the colors inverted, the font off. Frank found me staring at it and immediately dragged me away. "Don't touch it," he hissed. "Don't even look at it. Go home now, call in sick tomorrow." "What? Why? It's just a sugar packet." His expression was deadly serious. "It's marked you. Breaking that rule, it opens a door. Just for a second, something noticed you. Go home. Check your apartment thoroughly before entering. Look for anything out of place. Anything that wasn't there before." "What should I do if I find something?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He hesitated. "Run," he said finally. "Leave everything behind. Start over somewhere else." I did as he said. I searched my apartment carefully before unlocking the door. Nothing seemed amiss. For 3 days, I called in sick, jumping at shadows, sleeping with the lights on. Nothing happened. I began to think Frank had overreacted. But this morning, I found it. A sugar packet. Sitting in the middle of my kitchen table. The logo on the packet inverted, the text in that wrong font. I hadn't put it there. I live alone, and my doors were locked. As I stare at it now, I can swear the packet occasionally vibrates, just slightly, like something inside is trying to get out. Sometimes, when the apartment is completely quiet, I can hear a faint whisper coming from inside the paper rectangle. It knows my name. I'm writing this as a warning. If you ever work the graveyard shift at the Starlight Diner, or any place with strange rules, follow them exactly. No matter how silly they seem, no matter how small the infraction might appear. Because the rules aren't there to control you. They're there to protect you. I'm leaving town tonight. I don't know if it will help, but I have to try. If I don't update this post in a week, well, let's just say I've been applying for day jobs only. And if you ever see a sugar packet with an inverted logo, for God's sake, don't touch it. Don't even look at it directly. It might notice you too." The bell above the diner door jingled, pulling me back to the present. It was 11:48 p.m. Time to clock in. Time to face another night at the Starlight. Time to hope those rules were enough. The back door of the Starlight Diner slammed shut behind me, the metallic clang echoing in the empty alley. The air outside was thick with the humid chill of a late summer night. My watch read 11:52 p.m., Rule 1 check. But the sugar packet in my pocket felt like a lead weight, a constant, vibrating reminder of my slip up, of the unseen eyes now possibly fixed on me. I hurried around to the front, the neon glow of the "Open 24 hours" sign buzzing overhead. I hesitated at the entrance, peering through the window. Maria was already behind the counter, wiping it down with a practiced, wary motion. Frank was nowhere in sight. Good. Less Frank meant less chance of him noticing my frayed nerves, my jumpiness. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the door, the bell jingling a hollow, almost mocking sound in the quiet diner. Maria nodded curtly as I walked behind the counter. "You're on coffee tonight," she said without looking up. "Frank's in the back office. Something about inventory." Her voice trailed off. A subtle tension in her shoulders that mirrored my own. I didn't press her. Inventory was diner code for something weird is happening, and Frank's trying to figure out how to pretend it isn't. I busied myself brewing coffee, the familiar, comforting aroma usually a small solace in this bizarre job. Tonight, it just smelled bitter. Like burnt sugar. My hand instinctively went to my pocket, touching the cursed packet. I pulled it out, staring at the inverted logo, the wrong font. It seemed to pulse faintly in my palm. "What's that?" Maria voice sharp, her eyes suddenly fixed on the packet. I quickly shoved it back into my pocket. "Nothing," I said too quickly. "Just a new sugar packets. From home. Lame, even to my own ears." Maria narrowed her eyes but thankfully didn't press it further. "Just be careful tonight, okay?" she said, her voice softer now, almost worried. "Things feel off." "Off how?" I asked, the word catching in my throat. She shrugged, a shiver running down her spine. "Just colder than usual, quieter. And booth 7 feels heavy." Booth 7, rule number 8. Booth AV7 is off limits for cleaning between the 7 a.m. and 4:31 a.m. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I glanced at the booths. The red vinyl seats gleaming dully under the fluorescent lights. Booth 7, nestled in the corner, seemed darker, somehow. Like it was absorbing the light around it. "Maybe it's just the weather," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Maria just gave me a look that said she knew, and I knew. That the weather had nothing to do with the creeping unease that settled over the Starlight Diner after midnight. The first hour of the shift crawled by. A couple of late-night stragglers stumbled in, ordered coffee and Grazy Spoon fare, and left as quickly as they came. By 1 a.m. the diner was empty, save for Mary and me, the low hum of the refrigerators, and the ever-present, unsettling silence. 1 a.m. Maria murmured, checking. "Time to pair up." She gestured towards booths 1 through 6. "You take the front, I'll take the back. Rule number 3, always work in pairs after 1 a.m., except in the walk-in freezer. Never enter the walk-in freezer with another person." The walk-in freezer, I shivered, remembering Sarah, frozen and humming. We moved to our assigned sections. The diner feeling vast and echoing now, the silence amplifying every creak and groan of the old building. I started wiping down tables, trying to keep busy. To keep my mind from drifting to sugar packets and eyeless customers. As I wiped down booth 3, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement in the mirror behind the counter. Rule number 11. The mirrors behind the counter sometimes show reflections that don't match the diner. Ignore these and keep working. I glanced at the mirror. My reflection stared back, wiping down the booth just like me. But something was wrong. My reflection was paler somehow, and its movements were slightly jerky, unnatural. Like a puppet on strings. Not quite in sync with my own. I quickly looked away, focusing on the napkin holder, forcing myself to breathe. Echoes, Maria had called them. Things that drew your attention if you stared too long. I scrubbed harder at the table, trying to erase the image of my distorted reflection from my mind. Moving to booth 4, I heard a faint sound from the back of the diner. A low, rhythmic breathing. Heavy, wet breathing like someone struggling to draw air. The same breathing I'd heard outside the bathroom door. My blood ran cold. I glanced towards the kitchen, towards booth 7, towards the source of the sound. Booth 7, off limits between 4:07 a.m. and 4:03 a.m. But it wasn't even 2 a.m. yet. The breathing grew louder, closer. It seemed to be coming from booth 7. Impossible. No one was supposed to be in booth 7, especially not now. I grabbed the phone, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I needed to call Frank. Needed to tell him about the breathing, about booth 7. Just as my finger hovered over the "though" to dial out, the jukebox in the corner sputtered to life. Not the usual tinny pop music it usually played, but "Teenager in Love" by Dion and the Bellmans. Rule number 4. If the jukebox starts playing "Teenager in Love" by Dion and the Bellmans between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., immediately proceed to the kitchen until it stops. Do not sing along. But it wasn't even 3 a.m. yet. It was barely 2 a.m. Why was it playing now? And that breathing, it was louder now, rasping, wheezing, like it was right behind me. Panic clawed at my throat. Rules were breaking down. Things were happening out of order. Something was wrong. Terribly, terribly wrong. I looked towards the kitchen, towards the supposed safety of rule number 4. But the kitchen door, it seemed further away than it should be. The diner itself seemed to be stretching, distorting, just like the cereal aisle in Walmart. Just like the reflections in the freezer doors. And the breathing, it was definitely coming from booth 7 now. Not just breathing, but whispering. Faint, sibilant whispers, too low to understand, but close enough to feel, to vibrate in my bones. I took a step back, away from the whispering booth, away from the distorted diner, towards where? Nowhere felt safe. Nowhere felt right. Then, I heard it. My name, whispered soft as a breath, but clear as a bell in the unnatural silence. Sarah. It came from the kitchen, from the direction of booth 7. Rule number 9. If you hear someone calling your name from the kitchen, ignore it unless you can clearly see Frank's face. But it wasn't Frank's voice. It was Maria's. But distorted, stretched, wrong, like her voice played backwards, slowed down, and layered over itself. Sarah, help me. The whisper came again, closer now, laced with a desperate plea that tugged at my heart. Maria. Was she in trouble? Was she hurt? Maybe something had happened in the kitchen, something rule-related, something bad. I hesitated, torn. Rules screamed at me to stay put, to ignore the voice, to run to the kitchen to hide. But Maria, her voice, that desperate whisper, "Sarah, pleasey." My feet moved before my brain could catch up. Ignoring every instinct, every rule, every shred of common sense, I started walking towards the kitchen, towards booth 7, towards the whispering voice that called my name, towards the darkness that waited there. "Maria," I called out, my voice trembling, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Maria, is that you?" Silence. The jukebox continued to croon about teenage love, the off-key melody grating on my nerves. A soundtrack to my impending doom. The breathing from booth 7 hadn't stopped, but now it was softer, almost expectant. Then, the whisper came again, closer, clearer, laced with a sob I could have sworn was real. "Sarah, please, I'm hurt." It was Maria's voice, I was almost certain of it. Distorted, yes, wrong somehow, but undeniably hers. And that sob, it sounded like genuine pain. My coworker, my only ally in this nightmare diner, was in trouble. Could I really just stand here, paralyzed by fear and a list of nonsensical rules, while she was possibly suffering, guilt-warred with terror? The rules screamed, ignore it, ignore it, ignore it. But Maria's voice of it pleaded for help. And wasn't that what you were supposed to do? Help your friends, especially in a place like this? Against my better judgment, against every warning bell clanging in my head, I took another step towards the kitchen. "Maria, where are you?" I called out again, my voice louder this time, echoing in the cavernous diner. "In here," the whisper replied, seemingly coming from just beyond the kitchen door. "Booth 7, help, booth 7. It kept coming back to booth 7, the off-limits booth. The booth, Maria said, felt heavy. The booth from which the wet breathing emanated. The booth that was now, apparently, holding my injured coworker. Logic, reason, self-preservation, they all dissolved in a wave of adrenaline and a desperate, foolish hope that I could actually help. Maybe Maria had just tripped, maybe she'd just gotten locked in the booth somehow. Maybe the rules were just precautions. Maybe, just maybe, I was overreacting. Yeah, right, who was I kidding? But the thought, however flimsy, was enough to propel me forward. I walked faster now, almost jogging, towards the kitchen door, towards booth 7, towards the whispering voice that was slowly, surely, luring me in. As I approached the kitchen, the diner seemed to shift again. The walls seemed to stretch, the booths to deepen, the shadows to lengthen and writhe. The air grew colder, the fluorescent hum louder, more insistent, like a swarm of angry bees trapped in the ceiling fixtures. The kitchen door loomed ahead, a dark rectangle in the distorted space. Booth 7 was just beyond it, tucked away in a shadowy alcove I'd never really paid attention to before. Now, it seemed to pulse with a faint, inner darkness, a void in the already dim light of the diner. I reached the kitchen door, my hand hovering over the handle. Rule number 9, if you hear someone calling your name from the kitchen, ignore it unless you can clearly see Frank's face. I strained my eyes, peering through the small, grimy window in the door. Darkness, shadows, nothing but the vague outlines of stainless steel counters and hanging pots and pans. No Frank, no Maria, just darkness, and that whispering voice. "Sarah, please, if it hurts, I had to see. I had to know if Maria was really in there, if she really needed help." Rules be damned. I was going in. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the kitchen door and stepped inside. The kitchen was different, larger than it should be, somehow. The stainless steel surfaces seemed to stretch into infinity, reflecting the dim light in distorted, unsettling ways. The familiar smells of grease and coffee were gone, replaced by a cold, metallic odor, like blood and ozone. Booth 7 was there, tucked in the corner, just as Maria had described. But it was wrong. It seemed to sink into the floor, to recede into the shadows, deeper and darker than any booth should be. It was like looking into a hole torn in the fabric of reality. And the breathing, it was deafening now, a wet, rattling wheeze that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. It was coming from booth 7, definitely booth 7. "Maria," I called out again, my voice barely a croak. "Maria, are you in there?" Silence. Just the breathing, and the jukebox, still playing its saccharine tune, now sounding mocking, sinister. Then a faint movement from within booth 7, a shadow shifting, a flicker of something. "Maria," I repeated, taking a hesitant step closer. "Is that you?" "Yes." The whisper came, weak, strained. "Sarah, help." It was definitely Maria's voice. No doubt about it. But something was still wrong. Terribly wrong. The distortion, the echo, the underlying wrongness of it. But the plea for help was too real, too desperate to ignore. I took another step and another, moving closer to booth 7. Closer to the darkness, closer to the whispering voice. The breathing intensified, growing louder, more ragged, almost excited. As I reached the edge of booth 7, I could finally see inside. Or almost see. The booth was shrouded in shadow, a thick, impenetrable darkness that seemed to swallow the light. But within that darkness, I could make out a shape. A vague, human shape, slumped against the back of the booth. "Maria," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Are you okay?" The shape shifted, moved, and then a hand emerged from the shadows. A pale, slender hand. Reaching out, fingers twitching weakly, Maria's hand. I recognized the chipped nail polish, the small silver ring she always wore. "Sarah," the whisper came again. Closer now. Right in front of me, seemingly emanating from the booth itself. "Help me please, I'm stuck." My heart lurched. Stuck. What did she mean, stuck? Trapped in the booth somehow. Maybe she'd fallen, maybe she was wedged in, injured, unable to move. I had to help her. I couldn't just leave her there, trapped in the darkness, whispering for help. Ignoring every warning, every rule, every instinct screaming at me to run, I reached out the hand. It was cold. Clammy, and too thin, too fragile. Not quite Maria's hand, but close enough. Almost. "I'm here, Maria," I said, my voice trembling, my hand gripping hers tightly. "I'm gonna help you." And then, the shadows in booth 7 shifted again. And the breathing stopped. Replaced by a low, guttural chuckle. The hand in mine tightened, its grip suddenly becoming impossibly strong, fingers digging into my flesh like icy claws. And from the darkness of booth 7, a voice spoke. Not Maria's voice, not distorted, not echoed, not whispered, but clear, cold, and sharp as shattered glass. "Thank you, Sarah," the voice hissed, right in my ear, even though the booth was still shrouded in shadow. We've been waiting for you." And then, the darkness in booth 7 reached out and swallowed me whole. The darkness hit me like a physical force, cold and suffocating, pulling me down into booth 7. One moment I was reaching for Maria's hand, the next I was engulfed, swallowed by a void that felt less like a booth and more like nothingness. Panic seized me, a cold, paralyzing dread that squeezed the air from my lungs. I tried to pull my hand back, to yank myself free from that icy grip, but it was no use. The hand held fast, its grip tightening, dragging me further into the darkness. I thrashed, kicking, clawing at the vinyl seat, trying to find purchase, something to hold on to. But there was nothing, just darkness, and cold. And the crushing weight of something pressing down on me. The voice chuckled again, that cold, sharp sound echoing around me, though I couldn't tell where it was coming from. "Don't struggle, Sarah," it hissed, the words seeming to vibrate directly into my skull. "It's rude to refuse an invitation. Invitation. Invitation to what? To be swallowed by a sentient booth in a haunted diner. To become whatever thing was now dragging me deeper into the void." My mind's squealant, terrified shriek. I closed my eyes, bracing for something. Pain. Oblivion. Something worse. But then nothing. The dragging stopped. The crushing weight lifted slightly. The icy grip on my hand loosened, though it didn't release me entirely. The darkness remained, but it felt less oppressive somehow, more like shadow than void. Slowly, hesitantly, I opened my eyes, and blinked again. I was still in booth 7, but different. The booth was no longer shrouded in impenetrable darkness. The dim, yellow light of the diner filtered in, revealing something. I was sitting on the red vinyl seat, slumped against the back, just as I had been a moment ago. But the booth itself, it was deeper, longer than it should be. The table stretched out in front of me, impossibly far, disappearing into the shadows at the far end. The walls of the booth seemed to curve inwards, closing in, pressing down. It felt claustrophobic yet vast all at once. And across from me, in the dim light, I could see it. It was vaguely human-shaped, but wrong. Tall and gaunt, like the man at the door, but more so. Its limbs were too long, too thin, its joints bending at unnatural angles. It was dressed in something that resembled a diner uniform, but faded, tattered, like it had been worn for decades. And its face, it was featureless. Smooth, pale skin where a face should be, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just blankness, except not entirely blank. In the center of that featureless expanse, a faint line appeared, curving upwards, stretching wider, wider a smile. Too wide, too sharp. Just like the eyeless woman, just like the reflection in the freezer door. A smile that promised nothing but pain and oblivion. "Welcome, Sarah," the thing said, its voice a chorus of whispers, overlap and echoing, like a dozen voices speaking at once. "We've been expecting you." I tried to speak, but my throat was frozen, my voice trapped somewhere deep inside my chest. Fear held me captive, paralyzed, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to even scream. The thing's smile widened. "You broke a rule, Sarah," it whispered, its featureless face somehow conveying a sense of amusement. Hunger both. "Rules are important. They keep things in place." It gestured around the distorted booth, the stretching diner, the oppressive darkness. "Without rules, things unravel." Unravel. That's exactly what it felt like. My reality, my sanity, everything I thought I knew about the world, was unraveling around me, thread by thread. "Boot accidents happen," the thing continued, its voice almost gentle, in a terrifying, predatory way. "Rules get broken. Doors open." It leaned closer, its featureless face inches from mine, its cold breath washing over me, smelling of dust and decay. "And when doors open, things come through." I finally found my voice, a weak, desperate croak. "Hake, what do you want?" The thing chuckled again, that chilling, multi-voice sound. "We want. Oh, we want everything. Your fear, your pain, your essence." It reached out a long, skeletal finger and traced a line down my cheek. "You smell fresh. Untainted. Delicious." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken horror. I knew with a chilling certainty that this thing, this echo, wasn't talking about food. It was talking about me. "But," it continued, its smile widening further, impossibly wide now, stretching almost to its non-existent ears. "We are fair. Rules are rules, even, for us, fair." What was it talking about? "You broke Rule 12, Sarah," it whispered. "Small infraction, yes. But the rule broken nonetheless." The lights flickered. "You moved. You were noticed. Rule 12. If the neon opened 24 hours. Sign outside flickers twice in quick succession. Proceed to the back office and remain there until it stabilizes." No, wait. That wasn't Rule 12. Rule 12 was, if the lights flick 3 times in quick succession, stand completely still until they stabilize. 3 flickers. Not 2, 3. And I had moved. Just a little. But I had moved. "So," the thing continued, its voice taking on a sharper edge, "we will offer you a choice. A chance to redeem yourself. A choice. Redemption." This thing was offering me a choice. In this nightmare diner, surrounded by darkness and whispers and featureless horrors. It seemed too good to be true. And in a place like this, too good to be true usually meant deadly. What kind of choice?" I stammered, my voice still, weak, but a flicker of desperate hope igniting within me. The thing leaned back slightly, its smile softening, almost. "A game, Sarah," it whispered. "A simple game. Follow one more rule, one last rule. And perhaps you will be allowed to leave. Perhaps. One more rule. Just one, and I could maybe get out of this. Back to the diner, back to Maria, back to something resembling normalcy." It sounded insane, impossible, but it was a chance. The only chance I had. "Okay," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Okay, I'll play your game. What's the rule?" The thing's smile widened again, that terrifying, impossible grin. It reached into its tattered uniform and pulled out something small, white, and rectangular, a sugar packet. But not just any sugar packet. This one was wrong. The logo inverted, the font distorted, just like the one I'd found in my apartment. Just like the one that had marked me. It held out the packet to me, its long, skeletal fingers twitching. "Rule 13, Sarah," it whispered, its voice a chorus of eager anticipation. "The final rule. And the most important." It pushed the sugar packet closer, almost touching my face. "Rule 13, it hissed. Never, under any circumstances, acknowledge the waitress in white." It paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. Then its featureless face tilted slightly, its smile widening to grotesque, a parody of human emotion. "And Sarah," it whispered, its breath cold on my cheek, "she's been waiting to serve you." And then, from the shadows behind the thing, from the deepest, darkest corner of booth 7, a figure emerged. Tall, slender, dressed in a pristine white waitress uniform, starched and spotless, impossibly white in the dim light. Her face was hidden in shadow, obscured by the brim of her white cap. But I could feel her gaze, cold and piercing, fixed on me. The waitress in white. Rule number 13. The waitress who wasn't on the schedule. The waitress I was never, under any circumstances, to acknowledge. And she was holding something in her hand. A silver tray. And on that tray a single, steaming mug of coffee. Diner coffee. After 2 a.m., different coffee. Coffee that Billy had drunk. Coffee that had driven him mad. Coffee that smelled faintly of sulfur. The waitress in white stepped forward, gliding silently across the distorted floor of booth 7. Her featureless face still hidden in shadow, her cold eyes fixed on mine. She extended the tray, offering me the steaming mug. "Your order, Sarah," she whispered, her voice like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Graveyard shift special. The aroma of the coffee wafted towards me, thick, bitter, and undeniably wrong. It smelled of darkness, of decay, of something ancient and hungry. It smelled like Booth 7, and I knew with a chilling certainty that this was it. This was the game. This was my choice. Acknowledge the waitress in white. Accept the coffee. Break Rule 13. And what? Become like them. Become one of the echoes, trapped forever in this distorted diner, serving featureless horrors for eternity. Or what? What was the alternative? Refuse. Break the thing's rules even further. What would happen then? Would it simply take me? Devour me whole? My gaze flickered to the sugar packet still clutched in the featureless thing's hand. Rule 13. Never acknowledge the waitress in white. But what if acknowledging her, refusing the coffee, was the real rule to break? What if defiance was the only way out? My heart hammered in my chest, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence of Booth 7. Time seemed to slow, stretching, distorting, just like the diner itself. Everything hinged on this moment, on this choice. Coffee or something else, compliance or defiance, life or something far, far worse. I looked at the waitress in white, her face still hidden in shadow, the steaming mug of coffee offered in her pale, slender hand. I looked at the featureless thing across from me, its smile wide and hungry, its eyes waiting. And then, I made my choice. I reached out. Not for the coffee, but for the sugar packet. I snatched it from the thing's grasp, the paper crinkling in my trembling fingers. The thing recoiled, hissing, its smile faltering for the first time. The waitress in white stiffened, her silent form radiating a sudden, palpable anger. I held the sugar packet up, the inverted logo facing them, a defiant shield against the darkness. Rule 13, huh? I whispered, my voice shaking but stronger now, fueled by a desperate, reckless courage. Well, here's a new rule for you. And then, with all the strength I could muster, I ripped the sugar packet open and poured the contents onto the floor of Booth 7, a small white pile of defiance in the heart of the darkness. The reaction was immediate. A deafening shriek tore through Booth 7, a sound that shattered glass and vibrated bone. The featureless thing recoiled further, its smile vanishing completely, replaced by a gaping, silent maw of nothingness. The waitress in white stumbled back, her pristine uniform flickering, dissolving at the edges. The darkness around me recoiled as well, shrinking back, receding, like a tide pulling away from the shore. The distorted booth began to distort, the walls straightening, the table shrinking back to a normal size. The oppressive cold began to lift, replaced by the familiar, greasy warmth of the diner. The jukebox sputtered, skipped, and then stopped. Silence descended, heavy ringing silence, but different now. Not oppressive, not threatening. Just silence. I blinked again, and again, my eyes adjusting to the returning light. I was back in Booth 7, the real Booth 7, red vinyl seats, formidable, the clown painting leering from the wall. Normal. Almost. The featureless thing and the waitress in white were gone. Vanished. Just shadows lingering in the corners of the booth, fading fast. My hand was still outstretched, trembling, empty. The sugar packet was gone. Lost somewhere in the darkness I had just escaped. I scrambled out of the booth, stumbling, gasping for breath, my legs weak and shaky. I looked around the diner. It was normal. Dimly lit, greasy, slightly depressing, but normal. Maria was behind the counter, wiping it down, just as she had been before. Frank was still. Knox was silent. The jukebox, open 24 hours. Sun hummed steadily outside. Sarah, Maria said, looking up, her eyes wide with concern. Sarah, what happened? You just disappeared. One minute you were here, the next gone. I stared at her, my mind still reeling, my body trembling. Booth 7, I whispered, my voice hoarse. The rules, I broke them, all of them. Maria frowned, confused. Booth 7, what are you talking about? You were just refilling sugar packets. Right here. She gestured to the counter in front of Booth 1. Booth 1. Not Booth 7. I looked around again, really looked. I was at the front counter, near Booth 1, just like Maria said. Booth 7 was across the diner, in its usual corner, looking perfectly ordinary, perfectly safe. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? A terrifying, rule-induced nightmare brought on by stress and graveyard shifts and too much bad coffee? Maybe it was just my imagination, fueled by fear and those ridiculous rules. Maybe the sugar packet in my pocket was just a sugar packet. Maybe the whispers, the darkness, the featureless horrors were all just in my head. But I still felt the cold, lingering dread in my bones. I could still taste the metallic tang of fear in my mouth. And in my pocket, where the cursed sugar packet had been, there was now only a faint, lingering vibration, And something else. A faint, sweet smell, like burnt sugar and sulfur. The bell above the diner door jingled. Frank emerged from the back office, stretching, yawning, looking perfectly normal, perfectly oblivious. "Morning, ladies," he said cheerfully. "Almost sunrise. Another night survived, eh?" Maria forced a weak smile. I just stared at him, at Maria, at the normal, greasy, slightly depressing Starlight Dinormal. Almost. But as Frank walked past me, heading towards the coffee machine, I noticed something on his red apron. A tiny, white stain. Right near his pocket. A stain that looked suspiciously like sugar. And as he turned away, I could have sworn, just for a fleeting moment, that his smile was just a little too wide. The neon, open 20 sign outside flickered. Once. Twice. And then, stabilized. Sunrise was coming. But somehow I knew the night was far from over. And the rules were still there. Waiting to be broken. Waiting to be enforced. Waiting for me. I looked down at my hand, still trembling slightly, and noticed something else. A faint, almost invisible, dusting of white powder clinging to my fingertips.